17. Rodin walked, taking the time to think. He had a lead, if only a slight one. Ratch was heading north. Of course Rodin would follow. But Helia's words played in his head. He found the image of Ratch coming to his mind, the one Malice had shown him on the screen. And he pictured the man in a chair, head in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably when he learnt of Effie's death. Even if the extent of his grief was exaggerated, Rodin trusted that he had grieved. Not simply for a worker that was no longer, but for the loss of a friend. Or more. Helia had hinted at love. And yet Rodin was contracted to remove the man, because Effie's father believed him to be responsible for the girl's death. Ratch was being punished twice over for something that was not in his hands. It was unfair, but life was unfair. You took the good times for the brief happiness they could provide, and hoped that it was enough to sustain you through the bad times. Life could end at any moment. There were no guarantees. And Ratch's life was over. What Rodin had said back in Helia's room was true. If he refused, someone else would be hired. If one tool didn't work, you used another. Rodin had no options. He needed to fulfill the contract. He needed to remove Ratch. There was the script, and the actions he was instructed to perform. He would find Ratch. He would use the lance to render the man paralyzed. He would perform the actions and deliver the script as quickly as he could. And then he would tell the man his sufferings were now over. He would make it as quick as he could. It was the best he could do. But first he had to find Ratch. North was vague, but it was a start. He spent the day tracking. He used his screen, following possible paths. He sought places Ratch would consider safe, places where he might have a few friends. Places he was likely to be aiming for. Heading north didn't simply mean making in that general direction. It was often used more as a euphemism. It meant making for the edge. The district sat around the dome, but buildings stretched out for many miles. To the east they reached water. To the south and west there were areas that were relatively safe, populated by those who chose to remain at a distance from society. They were protective of their privacy, and would often turn travelers back, but they were not violent. However, their cloistered nature made it hard for a newcomer to fit in. But to the north, things were different. It was a place wanderers tended to head for, dragged by some unseen force. A place for those who could not fit into the rough society that existed elsewhere. Dark with many corners. It was the place where people made for when they wanted to hide. It was dangerous. The districts close to the dome might be violent, but they had some semblance of rules. On the edge, it was every person for themselves. Some stories told of groups who banded together and attempted to live a more normal life, but there were many areas where anarchy held sway. There were tales of torture for fun, and even of cannibalism. Like all tales, Rodin didn't trust the details. But the underlying themes would be accurate. It would be possible to survive, but only with skill and luck. Rodin pored over maps and information. And a passage started to show itself. He didn't know how or why, but it grew in his mind. He traced a possible route, discovering what Ratch would come across along the way. In his mind, Rodin put himself in the position of the caring, terrified controller. How would he react to what he found? What would draw him? Rodin knew. It was nothing he could explain, more of a feeling than a logical conclusion. It was his internal voice. He had trusted it many times before. He knew it would guide him true. It was late when Rodin pushed himself through his exercise regime. He was exhausted as he prepared for bed. His mind was full of his contract, and the last few nights he had slept relatively well. The nightmares had been mild, and easy to keep back with images of the couple. He expected this night to be no different. He was wrong. It started with the woman again. He was holding her close. There was the sensation of skin next to his. Her features and body changed as she shifted, but all the time he felt a comfort, as if they were meant to be together. She spoke words that echoed his own thoughts. A whispered voice, her soft breath forcing the words into his ear, warm and cold at the same time.
We are meant to be together.
And in his dream he nodded. Because he knew it was true. He knew her name, but when he went to utter it, the word came out as nothing but sound, with no meaning. She said his name, only it changed. Maybe if she was slurring, it could be Rodin. But it could be something else. And he felt a separation. They were meant to be together, but this did not mean they were meant to be happy. Or that they would never separate. She morphed again, and he felt something on his arm. They were seated, balancing on a stool, and her nails were digging into his shoulder. He could smell the blood. Her nails raked and her fingers probed. He turned his head to see them, red, forcing their way into his muscle. Turning back, he saw her face. He knew this one. Again, no name, but he knew this woman. She had almost killed him. She was wearing nothing on her top half, and he saw the scar where she had removed one breast. Then he saw the bare eye socket where he had stabbed her eye out. And with her mutilated head, she turned to face him. He pushed her back the only way he knew how. The image of the fat man's genitalia, the couple on the bed. The woman with the broken face smiled. She pulled off the remainder of her clothes and reached for something. He couldn't make out what it was, but she rammed it between her legs. Her jaw twisted, a split in her cheek opening up. He saw teeth through the tear, saw her push her tongue through the crack. Saw her smile as she added to the blood at her feet, moaning as she did so. He remembered the pain she had inflicted on him, and the pleasure she had taken in this. He remembered her excitement at the torture. How could he defeat the memory of a psychopathic, sadistic killer, with the image of a mutilated body? It was like trying to use oil to put out a fire. She was standing over him now. He was on the floor, unable to get away, with no strength in his body. Her blood was dripping onto his chest. She lowered herself and he felt the warmth from her body, her fluids. The crimson spread across his chest as she moved rhythmically, something sharp pushing against his breastbone. Whatever she still had between her legs was unrecognizable, nothing but a dark red tube. And he heard her talking. She was talking of the delight of the pain. She cried out at the beautiful bite, the enticing agony. And she thanked him. His gift to her, she told him, was exquisite, like nothing she had ever experienced. And for that she would do the same for him. She would be there for him, returning his gift tenfold. Another image rushed into Rodin's mind. Another body, again unclothed. But he knew who this was. He held Paskia close, her head buried into his shoulder. She was quivering slightly, and he knew it was not from the temperature. It was warm in the artist's studio as they posed, holding their intimate embrace as pencil scratched on paper. Part of Rodin was aware of the artist's eyes traveling over their bodies, her pale slight frame, his scars and muscles. He wondered if the artist would find the mark behind her ear, if that was visible through the curtain of her hair. She muttered something. He felt her lips brushing his chest, a drop of moisture forming. He struggled to make out the words.
This is not you.
He shut his eyes.
This is not who you are.
And then his eyes were open. It was dark in his room. He felt the chill in the air as the sweat on his body cooled. He wanted to pull the covers up, yet at the same time he wanted to feel his skin react. He needed to feel the bumps as hairs stood to attention. He needed to know he was alive. That this wasn't another part of the dream. And her words came back to him. This is not who you are. But what was she referring to? He was not a model. But that was who he had been. In the dome, working undercover as the artist's assistant, he had modeled. He had stood, sat and lay naked with Paskia while the artist sketched. With his body uncovered, there was no pretense. That was who he was, scars and all. The artist had been fascinated by the marks on Rodin's body, as had Paskia. In a place where body alterations were so commonplace, where muscles could be added in a simple surgical procedure, where imperfections could be ironed out over a few hours, the fact that Rodin's body was far from perfect in its appearance was bound to arouse interest. But Rodin had explained it in a way that he had come to realize was close to the truth. The story he told was that his earlier years had not been good. He hinted at things he had done that had aroused the interest of authority. In doing so, he hinted that the scars came from crimes he had committed. In reality, Rodin did not see them as crimes but as part of his job. When the artist wondered aloud why Rodin did not have the scars removed, he had spoken the words he had prepared, that the scars were a constant reminder of his mistakes. That they were part of what had made him the man he now was. Regardless of the rights or wrongs of his past acts, they had formed who he was. Removing them would take away his past. And every word of that was the truth. They did remind him of his past, especially his mistakes. Every wound told of a time he had been careless. Every one was a lesson. And every one had ultimately strengthened him. So his body was who he was. Without it, he was not Rodin the mercenary. None of this helped him understand Dream Paskia's words. If she was not talking about his body, what did she mean? Was it something he was doing? But again, he was a mercenary. All those acts in his past, they were all connected with his job, and his job was who he was. It wasn't as if he could take a break from it. He thought of the money he had in the bank, and everything he had stored elsewhere. He could disappear and live a life of ease. But that would not be him. He wouldn't be able to settle down, and he knew it. Besides, without the images, how was he to combat the nightmares? The rest of his sleep, when it came, was uneven. The nightmares stayed in the shadows, but they were close enough that he was alert, ready for when they would reappear. And when he awoke, he knew the day was not starting well. His morning routine tired him. His first coffee didn't taste good, and he splashed the hot liquid on his leg. When he left his room, there was moisture in the air with the promise of rain. He wasn't thinking straight when he set off. He needed to walk. He let his feet take him where they wanted to. They knew these streets and they had their set patterns. He had walks that he did not need to think about. So his feet led him along the alley, the shortcut from his building to one of the parks. A route he had taken many times before. Even as he entered the alley, part of Rodin was telling him it was a bad idea. Routines could be studied. They could be used. Know a man's routine, and it was possible to reach his destination first. If a man was following his own routine blindly, he was not thinking. Routines were a trap. Especially routines that led into hidden alleys.